Hello, everybody. Good evening. Apologies for the late start. It's entirely my fault, as always. You can never be too prepared with technology, and I won't cast aspersions on Facebook, but it's Facebook's fault too. Welcome to a very special authors event. I've been looking forward to this for quite a while, and here we are now. Thank you for joining us. My name is Sean Murphy. I'm the executive director of 1455. We're a nonprofit arts organization. And what we're doing is building a writers community via our virtual presence, where we do free events like this one, our annual literary festival. We've got an author workshop series, an interview series, and a host of other free content. And we're also building a writers retreat in Winchester, Virginia. If you want to check out what we're up to, I encourage you to visit us at 1455litarts.org. And I continue to be delighted to partner with our friends at the historic DC's Potter's House venue. And I'm joined tonight by our friend Talia Jaffe, who I'm going to introduce now and let her say a few words about Potter's House and their mission and why we're working together on this. Talia, take it away.
Thank you so much, Sean, and welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. I'm Talia Jaffe, the Events and Operations Manager here at the Potter's House, and we're delighted to have you here virtually to welcome Philippe, and are so grateful for our rich and growing partnership with 1455 Literary Arts under Sean's skillful leadership. For those of you who don't already know the Potter's House well, welcome, and for those of you who are old friends, welcome back. For those who are newer, we're a nonprofit social enterprise, a bookstore, cafe, and event space, and we've been serving up radical hospitality in Adams Morgan since 1960, which means we're celebrating our 60th year this year. We've always been a hub for conversation, activism, and action, as well as community transformation. But as you can imagine, our role as a community connector looks a little bit different these days. Interactions in the shop and online have become even more precious, and our commitment to hospitality continues. To give you just one example, through our Pay It Forward program, this last September, we gave over 800 free meals to neighbors who would have otherwise gone hungry. That's just one manifestation of our commitment to hospitality, and it's one we intend to continue. And so are gatherings like these. While we can't gather in person, we're still working hard to find ways to bring folks together, and tonight's event is one of them. We're especially thrilled to have Philippe here with us this evening because of his devotion and commitment to raising awareness for the environment and conservation issues for all ages. One of the pillars of the Potter's House mission is care for the earth, and the Endangereds no doubt adventurously advocates for just that. We are well stocked with copies of Philippe's book available for sale in store at the Potter's House, or if you'd like it delivered to your door, you can do so at bookshop.org/shop/PottersHouseDC. We'll throw that link in the comments as well, so you have access to it right as we speak. All of that being said, thank you all for joining us, and especially to you, Philippe and Sean. Thank you in advance for what I know will be an extremely fruitful dialogue.
Talia, thank you so much. So without further ado, I do want to thank our mutual friend, Pamela Sorensen, who was instrumental in helping bring this and facilitate this event. It's a real honor to introduce Philippe Cousteau. Let me introduce him, please. For those of you that don't know, Philippe has been inspired by the legacy of his grandfather, Jacques Cousteau. Philippe is a multi-Emmy-nominated TV host and producer, as well as an author, speaker, and social entrepreneur. As a special correspondent for CNN, he's hosted several award-winning shows, including Going Green and Expedition Sumatra. Philippe has also hosted and produced several television programs for Animal Planet and the 8-part series Oceans for the BBC and Discovery Channel. As an author, Philippe's children's book, Follow the Moon Home, has been chosen for the prestigious Texas Bluebonnet Award Master List. In addition, he's co-written 2 award-winning books, Going Blue and Make a Splash. His most recent book, which we're here to discuss tonight, is The Endangereds, which I am delighted to say I read and loved, and we'll be talking about that in a minute. Philippe and his wife, fellow adventurer and TV host, Ashlan Gorse-Cousteau, reside in Los Angeles, California. Philippe, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Sean, it's such a pleasure. I also want to thank you, Sean, and Talia And of course, my dear friend Pamela Sorensen. It's I spent about 8 years in Washington D.C. though I live in Los Angeles now, and so digitally, but it feels like I'm coming home a little bit here. So a big fan of all the work that you all do, and that community in particular, having called it home for so many years. And it is still, actually, Washington D.C. is still the headquarters of the nonprofit that I run, Earth Echo International. So prior to this pandemic, I did get to DC relatively frequently, and always cherished the opportunity to do so. So really thrilled to be here, and a special shout out to my dear friend Pamela, who helped bring all of this together.
As she does. Well, listen, knowing that you come to DC often, I think we can all hope and agree that the world will return to some sense of normalcy. So we'll look forward to some further collaboration. But
indeed,
put that aside. Let's get the focus, and I think we both agreed, as we always do at these events. I think the best way to introduce an audience to the topic and the theme and the author is to let them read a little bit. So if you'd be inclined, I would love you to read a passage and give us a taste from the
well, I'm going to provide a little context first about the story, and then I was going to read chapter 22, which is a relatively short chapter, but I think really gives a sense of some of the humor and what these animals are up to. And so The Endangereds is a new book, as you said, with HarperCollins, just came out, and it's a labor of love for the last 2 years. I co-author it with an amazing writer, Austin Ashlan. And it's a story of a motley crew of endangered species. It's that come together, being rescued from starvation in the Arctic, the illegal pet trade, illegal wildlife, trade, and various different circumstances. They're brought to a facility in the Galapagos where they're administered a serum that will help them recover from their injuries and their illness. And unbeknownst to the scientists there, benevolent scientists in this facility, it also gives them a hyperintelligence. So secretly, these animals band together and they go on wild, crazy adventures around the world, kind of like an A-team for nature, thwarting various nefarious plots to harm nature. It's a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to work on. We're already writing book 2, actually, and so it's the first in a series, and it's just a rollicking ride that is really tapping into, it's for middle grade readers, tapping into that youthful love of nature and animals, and giving it a special spin. As I said, similar to what many of us will remember, the A-Team back in the day. So chapter 22, and each of the chapters is from the perspective of one of the main characters in the book. We have an orangutan, Arif. We have a pangolin, Wangari, named after the famous Kenyan environmentalist Wangari Maathai. We have a cheeky narwhal named Murdoch. For those of you who are A-Team fans, you'll recognize this name, similar name there. And then Nukilik is the polar bear, who's the really strong one in the group, the young, impetuous one. So this chapter is from Nukilik's perspective. Nukilik crouched behind the white septic tank beside Sheridan's cabin. When she had learned what the tank's purpose was, she had balked. But she was resigned to the fact that it was the most natural camouflage she was going to get in these parts. Using binoculars, she scanned the porch and the windows for signs of movement within the home. It was still dark, but morning was on the way and visibility was improving with every minute. Things appeared still for once. Maybe Sheridan had finally stopped pacing and gone to sleep. We're running out of cover, Wangari reminded everyone. Once the sun rises, Redtail will be visible for miles in every direction. It's now or never. Side note, Redtail is their plane that they use to get around. He may have finally gone to bed, Nukilik reported. We could have just done this when he was wide awake, Nuke thought again, but the others had trusted Arif's reasoning for waiting so long. She turned her head and glanced high into the north, where she could just make out the tilt rotor hovering in position several thousand feet up. She stole a glimpse at it with the binocs. Wangari was up there, manually piloting the craft in hover mode. A long rope ladder hung from its belly like a spider's thread. Arif was on his mark in the shadows of the cabin porch, locked and loaded. Nukilik was positioned for close-up surveillance. If things went south, they wanted some muscle on the ground. Otherwise, Nukilik had been strictly instructed to hang back and keep an extremely low profile. Not a natural feat for a polar bear. Crouching like this was putting a real crick in her neck. She might have protested more, but the truth was she didn't mind playing a supporting role. All this snooping around was nerve-wracking. Now, originally, Arif had hoped Wangari would sneak back inside the house during the night, search the remaining rooms of the cabin, and report back to the group. But no such luck. Sheridan had remained awake all night long. This is what I feared, Arif had finally decided. Let's fall back. And so they had switched up the plan. Kidnap Sheridan and then search the house. Why all the caution, Ukillik had wondered. I could just barrel in there and knock him flat. Well, he may have a gun, Arif had explained, and I don't want anyone hurt. So many extra parts to this plan, she thought to herself. But Ukillik didn't argue, which left the big mammals on the ground to overwhelm Sheridan while Wen was airborne nearby, hover parked in the getaway vehicle. Ukillik needed to relax. She rolled her shoulders to help release the tension. Ugh, she grouched, my neck's killing me. No kidding, Murdoch chuckled from half a world away. He suddenly spoke with a thick English accent, narrating, burrowed in the dirt behind a capsule full of sewage, deep in the wild frontier of the American Southwest, the giant polar bear basks in her natural habitat. He switched back to his normal voice. Can't imagine why you've got a crick in your spine. Cut the chatter, Ukillik complained. She was in no mood for jokes. She was really on edge. He's related to dolphins, Arif grunted. Chattering's all he's good for. You're a regular stand-up comedian, aren't you, Arif? Murdoch spouted. Keep throwing us zingers. I'd think twice before asking an ape to throw stuff at you, advised the pangolin. All right, barked the orangutan. Nook's right. Time to focus. I'm ready to knock now. Ukillik watched as Arif carefully ascended the steps. When, redeploy to your mark. When Murray comes to the door, he should be groggy and off guard, but everyone be ready for anything. The polar bear tensed. Copy that. Standing by. She found herself nervous but excited, ready for action, but also uncertain. The orangutan knocked on the door. Ukillik could hear the tilt rotor drawing closer quickly. Who is it? Sheridan shouted angrily. Arif pounded on the door again. All right, I'm coming, I'm coming. Heavy footsteps marched through the house. Murray Sheridan threw open the front door, head to toe in white long johns. Murdoch offered a low chuckle. Orangutan. Orangutan who? A deafening explosion ripped through the air. Instantly, Murray Sheridan went flying to the ground, tangled up in a great weave of big game netting. At the other end of the porch, smoke rose out of the barrel of Arif's net launcher. Murdoch crowed, orangutan on safari, all right. A suspicious stillness came over the cabin. Sheridan moaned on the ground, balled up and pinned down, squirming, but dazed. The great ape tossed his spent tool to the floorboards. Well, that about wraps things up, he grunted. Ukillik sprang forward on shaky legs. She lit a flare and waved it at the approaching tilt rotor. Wangari quietly guided Redtail into position over the cabin. The slack end of the rope ladder bunched up on the porch steps. Arif attached Sheridan's net to the ladder using the prongs of a grappling hook, and he glanced at the tangled-up human, then up at the aircraft. I bagged my limit for the day, Wan. Wangari saluted from the cockpit. I'm inbound. New Curtis say over the radio. Murdoch, you have the controls. Affirmative, the narwhal confirmed. Ukillik looked skyward. Her eyes widened at the tilt rotor high overhead. A spread eagle pangolin wearing goggles and a backpack, a parachute guideline trailing behind her, plummeted toward the earth. Great green ribbons, the polar bear gritted her teeth. Now she's just showing off. Ukillik, let's go, Arif called out over the noise of the hovering aircraft. She galloped over to the steps and reached out to grab the rising rope ladder just in time, while it took all her strength to simply hold on, spinning in circles right below Sheridan's tangled mass. Arif had already climbed halfway up the ladder's length. Several hundred feet high in the air over the desert southwest, the orangutan looked perfectly at ease. Redtail banked left toward its landing site half a mile away along the dry creek bed. With the first rays of the sun now hitting the hills in the distance, Ukillik watched Wangari deploy her red, green, and yellow parachute. Wangari landed hard on the cabin roof, rolling into a ball to absorb the blow. She detached the chute with a fluid motion and swung off the gutter into the porch. With the cabin to herself, she'd make quick work of finding the ferrets, or at least getting more answers. Ukillik had to admit, Arif's plan had worked in the end. Lucky ape, she muttered to herself. For a second, she could see it all coming together. They would rescue the ferrets quickly, head home to refuel, and then, finally, she could go home and find her mother. She'll never believe where I've been and what I've done. Orange leader, come in. Go ahead, Wen. What'd you find? That's just it, she grunted in frustration over the radio. Nothing. No ferrets, no broadcasting equipment, no weird devices. The bedrooms are empty. There's no basement, no guns, no cages. There's literally nothing of note here that we haven't already seen. Anyway, that gives a little bit of a sense of kind of in the thick of the action of these characters coming together to try and solve a mystery about their missing black-footed ferret friends in the Pacific, in the U.S. Southwest.
Well, Philippe, thank you for reading that, and I think that should give everyone a real good taste of not only the topic and the theme and the characters, but the great narrative energy and excitement. I think the best compliment I can give you is that reading this book in one breathless sitting made me feel like a kid again in all the best ways. And I'm sure while there's probably a lot of goals you had, to make an adult really feel like a kid again is a special achievement. So congrats on that.
Well, I appreciate that, Sean. That was certainly, there's a lot of Easter eggs in the book that we put in there specifically because we assumed that, there might be parents reading to their kids with this book, maybe the younger, that, it's targeted to about an 8 to 13-year-old age range, that middle grade reader. But we thought there might be parents reading this book to their kids a little bit younger. So we wanted to put a little of those kinds of Easter eggs that would be fun for adults to read as well.
Absolutely. Well, it worked. So I think the obvious question, right, before we get into it is the fundamental question. What was the inspiration for this particular book? How did it come about?
Well, I had the opportunity to sit down with the wonderful David Linker, our executive editor at HarperCollins about 2 years ago. And we were just scheming on, how could we do something in the fiction space? I've done a lot of, as you said, done an elementary school book, Follow the Moon Home, that's fiction. Done a couple of guides, Going Blue and Make a Splash for kids that are more like guidebooks on how to take action in your community to help the environment. We've got a lot of educational resources through Echo. I've done documentaries, all sorts of different things, some scripted stuff as well. And we wanted to tell a story in the fiction middle grade reader space. And, what was going around in my head was a lot of the statistics that we've been hearing over the last year or two coming out of the scientific and conservation community. Things like the fact that in my lifetime, in 40 years, we have seen a 50% decline in biodiversity on this planet, which is terrifying. The biodiversity is critical to maintaining the health of ecosystems that keep us alive, provide food, provide shelter, etc. We've also seen in 40 years, 68% of wildlife disappear on this planet. 68% of the amount of wild living creatures on this planet have disappeared in 40 years. Sean, I have a 16-month-old daughter, and whenever I look at her and I think about the kind of world that she is inheriting from my generation and preceding generations, that is so robbed of its wealth, of its natural wealth and beauty, but through no fault of her own, it really upsets me, as I'm sure it upsets everybody here. And so that was really the impetus. We wanted to be able to tap in and tell the story of endangered species and this biodiversity loss and the complexity in that, but in a way that's fun and exciting for kids first and foremost, but that is really exploring some real life issues. And the backstories of all the characters are based on real backstories of these types of animals and what they're facing in the wild. The types of issues around habitat restoration we look at in the Southwest with the ferrets and the prairie dogs, all of those are very real issues that we're facing right now. And in book 2, we continue to explore the Arctic and other places that are disappearing, and which is why Nikillik was starving in the first place in the opening of the book. Yeah. So it was really about trying to tap into what's really happening in the world, but in a way that could be fun and accessible.
Yeah, so I love that the book starts with kind of the at this point familiar scenario of the proverbial polar bear on the ice floe, and taking that and owning it, and then drawing a whole narrative out of that. I thought that was a clever touch. I do want to hear a little bit about how you settled on the 4 main characters. I mean, clearly you were using appropriately endangered or vulnerable species. And before you answer that, I will say, I'm glad to hear you're working on volume 2. I need more Murdoch. I'm a Murdoch fan. I need a narwhal, the sarcastic narwhal. So,
well, I can tell you, Murdoch features much more in book 2, and we also, because in the beginning of book 1, Nikillik is separated from her mother, and we don't know what happens, but we find out in book 2 what actually happened to her mom. But the animals themselves were a lot of back and forth actually in discussion. Particularly Arif was an inspiration to me because I did a show with, let me see if I can find this here. Should have thought of this before. I did a show with CNN called Expedition Sumatra, and a couple of years ago, where we went out to Sumatra. Orangutans are only naturally found in 2 islands in Indonesia, in Borneo and Sumatra. And the Sumatran species is highly endangered, and predominantly because it is, let's see here, where is that? Oh yeah, because it is, you know, it's highly prized, baby orangutans, for the illegal pet trade. It's a demonstration of wealth to be able to have an orangutan. Unfortunately, when orangutans get a little bit older, they're really cute when they're babies, and they have sharp teeth, and they start not being a great pet. And so a lot of these animals are rescued from the pet trade. And organizations like World Wildlife Fund, the Frankfurt Zoological Society, and others do a lot of work to try and rehabilitate those orangutans and release them back into the wild. So I visited this facility deep in the jungles of Sumatra, a day's ride from the nearest town in Jambi, and spent several days filming and with these orangutans and the people that are working night and day to rehabilitate them. And so that had always been a story that was very close to my heart. And I have a picture here. I hope it'll show up on here. Let's see. That is me with Violetta, a rescued young female orangutan at the facility. You'll see me in the background there. I'm actually sucking termites out of a piece of dried wood. You know, it's one of those things. It's always surprised what you'll do on camera. The way that orangutans learn from their mothers in nature is through mimicry. And so one of the ways that they teach orangutans and reintroduce them back into the wild, these babies, they have to teach them all the skills that mother would have taught them. And so one of those is how to find and eat termites, which are very high in protein and nutrition. So unbeknownst to me at the time, we're filming, I'm doing an interview with the head of the FZS, Frankfurt Zoological Society Rehabilitation Center. And I've got this amazing orangutan just hanging in a tree looking at me, just an arm's length from me. And the director is talking about how the different things they have to teach the animals, finding fruit and vegetables, things like that in the forest. And then he reaches down and breaks off a little chunk of like rotted wood full of termites. And he said, and we also have to teach them how to select termites out of wood. He said, do you want to go here? And he hands me this chunk of wood, and there's termites crawling all over it. And he's like, all you do is put your mouth up to the holes, and while she's watching you, and she's watching, these big eyes and very interested in what we were doing, this gorgeous baby orangutan. And I mean, I've got the camera rolling. I've got this guy staring at me like, get it together. And I've got this orangutan looking at me like, okay. And I'm thinking to myself, this is penance for my species having, you know, what happens is they kill the mother, the hunters kill the mother and steal the baby. And I was like, this is maybe the least that I can do to try and do this. So, you know, I started sucking the termites out of the wood. Tasted, got a lot of sawdust. They're all crawling in my beard and everything. And then handed it to Violetta, and she took it out of my hands and looking at me the entire time with their lips and just went sucking termites out of the wood too. So that was an amazing experience and stuck with me. And so I wanted an orangutan to be a member of this team. We chose a pangolin because a lot of people may not be familiar with what a pangolin is. You should look it up. It's basically like an armadillo with scales. They're highly endangered as well. They're part of the illegal pet trade in China. And they are captured for their scales, which is ridiculous because their scales, just like rhino horn, is basically the same stuff that our fingernails are made out of. But there are people that believe their scales in soup have regenerative, you know, aphrodisiacal powers, which is ridiculous. Nevertheless, pangolins are highly endangered for that. Of course, polar bears are kind of a poster child of the Arctic. We wanted a strong female character. Girl power, and so we chose Nukilik to be a female, and then you know, a narwhal. What kid doesn't love a narwhal, the unicorn of the ocean, just like you, Sean? We wanted to have an aquatic character, and so we just started thinking of a narwhal, and they've got this huge, actually modified tooth that looks like a unicorn horn coming out of the front of their face, and we love the A-team. We were like, this could be Murdoch, the kind of wisecrack, as you heard, wisecracking, you know, character, and so that's how it came together. As the 4 main characters. In the first book, we also feature 2 black-footed ferrets, also that are highly endangered, but a success story in many ways as they're slowly being reintroduced to the southwestern United States. It's kind of an example of successful conservation. So we thought that would be a fun. We needed 2 characters or a character that we were going to lose in the first book, back into the wild. so that we decided that the ferrets were great characters for that.
Well, that's a perfect segue to my next question, which was, we talk in this series about storytelling, say with a capital S, like, when we get into the nuts and bolts of storytelling, for non-writers, we quickly kind of realize that it's really, function more than form. And I think you really had your work cut out for you, right? You're trying to take some pretty sophisticated and urgent issues. So to make it accessible to a younger reader, I think it's, of course, a brilliant maneuver. It has to be successful, and I think it's very successful to give these kind of human or relatable characteristics to kind of gradually introduce, something that might normally be harder to grasp. But I'll say, as my father would attest, as very much a non-scientist, but with a big heart, I follow and understand these issues. But I have to say, even as an adult reader, frankly, it was refreshing and informative to get a better handle, kind of a distilled understanding of some of these issues in real black and white, where normally, even if you're reading the most brilliantly written scientific jargon or position paper, it's empowering, but it's reaching a certain audience. This is reaching a broader audience, but it's a very delicate dance to be able to make these human-like animals, but also get the issues. Talk a little bit about how you, kind of develop that strategy, because it's not as easy as it appears.
No, it's not. And a key partnership that we had, which I'll explain a little about later, was a partnership with World Wildlife Fund, and that was really important for us. I'll explain it in a second why. But in general, like any book, like any narrative story, we sat down and sketched out the narrative arc. We decided we wanted a team of animals, and then we had to really think through, well, how do they get these powers? And we created backstories for all the animals that aren't actually in the book, but that was for us to start there. We created, and I think this is good advice for any writer, is to think through what are the attributes, what are the character traits, what kinds of things would different characters do in different scenarios. And that's all, like, again, not ever been, it hasn't been published, certainly to date. We might do a little bit more of that in book 2, but probably not. It's really was a function for the writers, for Austin and myself, so that we would keep our characters true to their nature. And that was important, to start creating this world. We had to start creating some rules. One of those rules was that it was very important to us that all the science and facts and information and behavior of these animals is grounded in reality. Now, of course, except for the fact that they can fly airplanes. Like, that which is fantastic was purposefully fantastic and fantasy. But the underlying story and backstory about the black-footed ferrets and Ukillik and Arif and the quokka and the quag, the prairie dogs, we partnered with the World Wildlife Fund to and they had scientists, specialists with each of these animals read through, and they were terrific because they understood that these animals can fly airplanes. So clearly that's not really possible. And they can hold things because the serum gives them a little bit of physical changes as well. But we wanted the actual information about these animals to be real and to be grounded in science, and the conservation challenges that they're facing, which we allude to throughout the book, to be the real ones that they're facing, their backstories, etc. In the back of the book, we actually have information about real information about each of these animals, links to resources for kids to help these animals, and resources through Earth Echo for education resources. So thinking through the story arc, we knew we wanted the characters. We then reached out and built that relationship with World Wildlife Fund so that we would be true and authentic in terms of the information, particularly because of my brand and my legacy and the work that I do in conservation. We really didn't want to take too much liberty with that. And then, it's really just, what are those conflict points? We wanted to we wanted to figure out how to raise the stakes. And this is important. One of the things we were thinking through was, as opposed to being pedantic and giving people lots of scientific information, how do we make the stakes around endangered species really, really high? And what could be higher than life or death? Now, whether polar bears survive is not an issue for you or me, Sean, life or death. The Arctic collapsing is, but that's another story. But for Ukillik, a polar bear's living or dying is life or death. You couldn't get higher stakes than that. So that was also a way for us, and it was a literary kind of vehicle for us to be able to really ratchet up the stakes for these endangered species and dealing with the sustainability in nature, that their lives are on the line, and the lives of their loved ones are on the line, and their families are on the line, literally, if we don't solve these problems. So once we'd established stakes, personal stakes for Nuke and her mother, but then we also know the conflict in the book. How do we, what are the villains, and what is the central enemy that they're fighting throughout the course of the book? What is the story arc, and what's the resolution at the end? Your typical kind of literary, tools. Yeah. But in the context of this world that we created rigid rules around, backstories for all the characters, so that everything, would be consistent.
Yeah, and one of the things I really appreciated was also that the book doesn't shy away from the literal, the natural order of nature. For instance, when you get in with the prairie dogs, and I think there's a moment where maybe it's Nuke that says, "Why don't we just set them all free?" And the other character, I guess it's Reef, has to explain, well, the ferrets need to eat. Like, this is part of the ecosystem, and if this collapses, everything collapses. I mean, it's a bit of a subtle, minor point, but it certainly, the book, no matter what the age group, doesn't patronize. It doesn't, it's not fantasy. Like, well, these animals are friendly and they eat cotton candy. I mean, there's this fine balance between being very real. And I think it's important, though, for any reader, and again, I'll include myself. I'm not that naive to kind of these realities, and I'm a nature show freak, but kind of to be reminded about the ecosystem and how, whether it's a polar bear or a prairie dog disappearing, that has, catastrophic effect throughout the food chain.
Yeah, one of the consistent kind of themes in the book is balance. And one of the themes that we played with is this idea of things being out of balance. And so we come back to that often in the beginning of the book. What's happening in the Arctic? It's out of balance. The ice isn't there. The animals, the hunt isn't there. They're starving because things are out of balance. It goes through, and we start looking at what's happening with the prairie dogs in the Southwest, and that whole system is out of balance because the black-footed ferrets aren't there, and they need the predator to keep the prey and stay in balance. And so it's a theme we talk about a lot throughout the book and go to, and we do use the mechanism of being able to have Arif, the wise leader, being able to explain to the newest member, Nuke, some of these concepts, because she's been essentially up in the Arctic and is newly hyper, we call it hyper intelligence, and doesn't necessarily understand some of those elements. So yeah, that was a cheeky way for us to kind of teach a little bit, but have the characters learning, not the reader directly learning, but learning through the characters was the idea. But balance is key. I mean, when you've lost half the biodiversity on your planet, things are really out of balance. And ultimately, that is an issue for all of us when we talk about, food and weather and, all the issues that everybody's familiar with now. So.
Right. So I think it'd be really fascinating for at least the 1455 crew who are, used to kind of thinking, I would never say black and white terms, but, authors that write books, like there's just a certain set of challenges and rules and goals. But you have considerable experience now in front of a camera and behind a typewriter. Talk a little bit about, maybe some of the challenges. I mean, because I can appreciate it's storytelling, right? Whether you have a script that you're developing so that you can shoot and speak to a camera, but still, I guess, for lack of a better way to put it, you kind of don't have the net with a documentary, I would imagine. I mean, you have the beauty and you have the positive distraction of color and the main characters being the animals themselves. Here, it's a printed page. So what is it like for you, and what are some of the pros and cons of each medium?
Well, certainly with images, you have something else to confuse people, or distract people with. And unfortunately, specifically these days, as budgets have been cut on news, on documentaries, etc., the writing tends to be pretty poor in general. And I think in the visual medium, people rely too much on images and not enough on the writing. I found this to be so much fun because it allowed us to really focus, obviously, on the writing in a way that we had to paint the pictures with the words. And early on in my career in media and television, I was in Haiti doing a piece with CNN, and I had my producer, wonderful producer at the time, and I was in a charcoal market. Most of Haiti 90+% of Haiti has been deforested because their primary source of fuel is charcoal. And so I was in a charcoal market, And my producer, I was talking about what I was seeing, and my producer was like, don't just tell us what you're seeing. Tell us what you're smelling. Tell us what you're hearing. Tell us what the taste of the grit in the air. And so even I believe in television, certainly with journalism or reporting in that function, not necessarily a documentary with pretty pictures. But even so with that, if it's a first person perspective, trying to talk about all the senses is really important. And I talked a lot, and Austin and I went back and forth a lot. So in the book, we do our best to try and be like, there's grit in the mouth when they're underground fighting the prairie dogs. You know, they're smelling the grass in the prairie. We're really trying to salt air in Galapagos. We're really trying to build a world, but it's not ultimately too dissimilar from what I think good reporting in television is, which is giving people, making them feel like they're there, not just visually, but the other senses as well, as much as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is probably a cliche, but I remember back in, learning journalism, news is often defined as, the combination of what people need to know and what they want to know. But I found that storytelling, again, as a form, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or documentary or what have you, there's still that balance of, you need to get the messages across, but there has to be some interest in it. And again, it's commendable that you were able to very clearly and succinctly get these nuggets of information and insight, but do it in the context of an adventure story.
Well, Sean, you make a great point. There's fundamentals of good storytelling, regardless of the medium, right? You need character, setting, conflict, resolution. Those have been the ingredients forever. And the stronger that each of those pillars are, the better the foundation for people to remember and care about the story. And so, in visual medium, I think people get lazy because they have images. But that's what's really fun about writing is that you don't have that luxury, and trying to create all of those different elements and strengthen them as much as possible is a challenge, but is a lot of fun.
What I'm getting from this is that actually and it's easy to see, in the context of the book and how well it's written, that your vast experience in front of a camera and dealing with images has actually strengthened your acumen as a writer, because you understand less instinctively, but more through practice, what it requires and how to kind of get right to the heart of the matter without which a lot of writers suffer from, right? Especially in the written medium of get to the point or make me interested. But I would imagine, is it safe to say that, obviously I don't want to minimize because I can certainly attest to writing seldom gets easier. You get more familiar and you become more proficient, but the act of writing is still tricky and very difficult to duplicate consistently. But you're probably the first writer in the series that comes from a background where you're not just a straight writer, but it's clear that you bring that sensibility to the written page. But
I think it, probably to your point, it's like that pre-production that I'm used to in terms of in the media space.
Yeah.
Like I was saying, we're thinking through what are the character backstories. It's never going to end up on paper for the public, but we need to know what their motivations and who they are and why they're doing what they're doing, and the rules of the universe. There's one thing I can't stand in books or television is a lack of consistency, or where things logic gaps, where it's just like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would if they did this, then why are they doing that, and why did this happen if it didn't happen in this situation? So we went through that a lot. So I would say we spent probably 6 months in pre-production on this book, thinking through all of those things and starting to lay out the outline, and then started filling in the meat. And in that sense, I think book 2 is easier because a lot of that groundwork has been done.
Yeah.
But like you said, Sean, we're having to come up with these worlds and create the new locations and settings. And, how do we really not just lean on the fact that we've established these characters? We really need to create rich settings. And what do we learn from book 1? There are things we learned in book 1 that I think will make book 2 better. As we read through it a dozen times, you start thinking, maybe the action gets a little laggy here, or it's maybe a little too fast, and start to refine and massage. As any writer knows, you can edit something for the rest of your life until you can keep editing it 5,000 times. At a certain point, you could be like, okay, enough. We gotta put it out there. But and I'm sure as any devoted writer knows, watching. You always read stuff and you're like, oh, I might have done that differently now. But
You can't read your own work with a pen because you're going to start making edits on the spot.
It's the worst. So, but yeah, it's a lot of fun. At book 2, we're already, like I said, I just got the second draft actually today.
That's fantastic. Congratulations. And that's exciting as a new fan of the series. So talk a little bit about, and again, I think your situation is not unique so much as you come from a different place than most of our writers who we talk a lot about how writing is necessarily a solitary endeavor and it's you and the page, but you collaborated on this book. And I do want to give a shout out, I want to make sure I pronounce the name right. Ashlan.
Austin Aslan. And what an amazing, extraordinary writer.
I mentioned that at the beginning. I should have said it was co-written, but talk a little bit about, the art of collaboration.
Well, that was really important to me because we have a lot of different things going on. And when I was having a first conversation with Harper Collins, it's just been so fun to work with. Acknowledging that we have a nonprofit that we run, a television series at the time called Curbing Private Treasure on the Travel Channel. I host a syndicated show called Awesome Planet. We have a couple business projects that we're working on, so lots of different stuff. It became apparent pretty quickly that this is not something I was going to be able to do by myself. And so we cast about working with Harper and auditioned a lot of different writers. And really chose Austin because he in his writing sample, he dove right into the action and really clearly understood the characters, has a background in sustainability and conservation. And that showed through in terms of his really authentic desire to work on this book. This is a book born of a desire to create change, to inspire young people. This is a book that has a means to an end. It's not a means in and of itself. It's not an ends in and of itself, excuse me.
Right.
There's a purpose for this to try and advance a more healthy, sustainable world for us all. That's our life's work. And so I needed somebody that had the chops and had the experience to be able to really sit down and plow through writing a big book when we had 20 other things that we were juggling at the time. So that collaborative was absolutely critical, and Austin's genius shines through in so many of these stories and the story arc, and how he balanced the characters and really teased out, I think, their backstories and their motivation and their passion and the conflict. That was really Austin bringing that. I think it's key to know what you're good at and know what you're not good at, or know what you know and know what you don't know. And I was thrilled and privileged to be able to work with Austin on this.
That's great. And I think in the ultimate testimony to this is that you're working on a second book. So that speaks volumes as well in terms of the positivity of the experience and the collaboration. So it's clear that, based on the bio I read, which, by the way, folks at home, I had to truncate that from a pretty long one. So I do encourage you to check out Philippe's website for the myriad projects that he's been involved in and continues to do. But it's very clear that it's important to you, and I think for a variety of obvious reasons, but talk a little bit, if you'd like, about you definitely have an interest, not just in this book, but in your other projects, in trying to engage with a younger audience. And again, I some of that is just obvious, like duh, but talk a little bit. I mean, it's clear to me that that's a very personal passion for you to want to engage a younger demographic.
Yeah, Sean, it is very purposeful in that about 15 years ago, I founded a nonprofit called Earth Echo International. As I said, we're still headquartered in Washington, D.C., actually. Our executive director is based there. And growing up with my grandfather and his influence on me, being a pioneering explorer and filmmaker, and my father's work in film and television, I was always told, before we can really talk about conservation, we have to talk about education. And I do believe that something that's been missing in the environmental movement for the past 40 years is any really concerted and deep investment in education, in growing the constituency of people who care about these issues. Unfortunately, we are still fighting in this country a partisan perspective on environmental conservation, on clean air and clean water. And it's pretty shocking that in 2020, we are still fighting to protect the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, for God's sakes. I mean,
Yep.
concepts that that are established, that have worked. And I don't want to get into a tit for tat between Republicans and Democrats or Libertarians or any of that. That's not what this is about. What it is about is fundamental values. And it's about things that should, universal values, universal truths, I believe, that should be bringing us together, not dividing us. And so we recognize that the best way to build that kind of cultural and social foundation to support, regardless of socioeconomic opportunity, political persuasion, is to focus on youth. Youth have tremendous influence on adults, on business, and believe it or not, on politics. Now, we work with youth leaders at Ortheco around the world that have passed laws at 13 years old to put solar panels on municipalities as a requirement of new buildings. We've seen young people start businesses at 16, 17 for composting that have spread throughout their state. We've seen really extraordinary work that young people have done all over the world. And recognizing that that's how we grow the constituency of people who care about these issues and no longer allow them to become the kind of political division and a tool for division that they have become predominantly over the last 30 or 40 years, since the Reagan administration, for lots of different reasons we won't go into now. But
right.
You know, it's part of our broader strategy, a means to an ends, and ends of creating a healthy, thriving planet, and creating a populace that supports those issues, again, regardless of political affiliation. So youth and education is the best way to create that foundation in society. The only way to truly create it. Teaching, you know, getting adults to change behavior is virtually impossible at scale. And so it's getting people to adopt behavior the right way. And then the only caveat to the role of changing adult behavior is that young people people's kids have a tremendous influence actually on behavior of the household, what things are bought, where people go on vacation, things like that. So that is, you know, an issue for us in the work that we do.
Yeah, and I appreciate your perspective, and you know, I concur that we could and perhaps should have a lengthy separate discussion about kind of the, you know, the politics of this. But the notion of politics and art comes up repeatedly in these conversations. And what I usually say, and it's doubly so with an issue like conservation and the environment, is anyone that says don't bring politics into it is overlooking the fact that we're bringing politics into it is because it's already been politicized. So
that's absolutely correct. Yeah.
This is not happening in a vacuum. But I think what books like this are doing and the work you're doing, which of course, I mean, personally, I salute and encourage, is trying to find ways, and getting back to storytelling. Yes, you know, we need the op-eds and we need the brilliant academic pieces and the personal stories. All of those are critical. But I think one of the things that the creative class is learning, or is trying to learn in 2020, is if there's any hope of breaking through this, you know, increasing bifurcation of society, where it's like you take a position before you even know what it is, because that's just, you know, that's how you roll. I think
tribe, right? Yeah.
Storytelling to present some of these things in different ways so that it can get beyond the kind of he said, she said of the political debate kind of culture.
Well, and that's just it. And the good news is, you know, listen, in recent surveys, you have, you know, something like 65% of young Republicans rate climate change as a major issue that they want, you know, aggressive action to solve. So that's really how we're going to change this. And frankly, you know, the environmental movement has neglected that for decades. It's been really focused on tactical passing laws and things like that, and preaching to the converted. And that has not led to the kind of long-term sustainable, I think, social shifts that we need to make change. And so that's what we're focused on with youth. And you know, when my grandfather had the Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau on television in the 1960s and 1970s, there were like 7 or 8 channels on TV, right? So if you had a special on Sunday night on ABC, boom, everybody watched it. That's not the case now. So, you know, what we realized years ago was that for my grandfather's generation, your audience came to you. And what we realize now with this generation is you have to go to your audience, and you have to recognize that there are loads of different media pillars out there. So we have projects in virtual reality, books, television programs, in classroom education, after classroom education, after school education, distance learning projects, radio, I mean, you name it, we're developing all sorts of destination learning experiences, and entertainment experiences. So both thinking about the diversity of outlets for your media content, but then also the different generations, the different age levels we talk to, and then the different ways we talk to them, be it scripted, fiction stuff, or non-scripted documentaries. You got to do it all to have any kind of, I think, of a meaningful impact.
So what would you say to, people that are watching and will be watching this recorded video who are inspired and say, damn it, I do want to do something. Are there a few things that you recommend or suggest in terms of real action that people can take in their own personal lives to advance the cause or advance awareness?
Well, one thing I'll say to all the parents out there, or anybody actually, is as part of the partnership with World Wildlife Fund and Explore by the Seat of Your Pants and Earth Echo, we are doing in November, predominantly in November, end of October and November, a series of live webinars that I'm hosting that are free to register, where I will be talking to individual experts in the field that do science, conservation with these animals, experts from the Arctic, from Indonesia, etc. And each one will be exploring one of the different animals. We're doing the whole thing about pangolins for 40 minutes. We'll be doing a whole thing about black-footed ferrets, polar bears, the Arctic narwhals, etc. So that is one thing. I encourage people to go to the Endangereds.com. And we, scroll down, and there's classroom resources as well that World Wildlife Fund and Earth Echo developed. So for all the parents that have kids that are doing distance learning right now and looking for stuff for them to do, we'll have those free to register live webinars where they can ask questions of me and scientists in the field, learn about their careers. We'll be doing, and as I said, we have classroom exercises. World Wildlife Fund, great gifts. They have they're starting to sell out, but they have 100 special adoption kits with the Endangered, signed books, and little kits that support the different animals that are featured in the book. We also have at the back of the book, we have links and resources as well through World Wildlife Fund and Earth Echo that people can participate and learn more about the animals and support conservation of them. So.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. And we will absolutely make it a point when we do our summary of this event to put some of those resources and links on our website. Philippe, I would be remiss if I didn't at least acknowledge and kind of comment as a kid that lived through the 70s. Obviously, you're part of an iconic kind of continuum with your family. I would love you to just talk about maybe, well, first of all, when did you realize? Clearly you were literally born into it, right? But I'm curious, both in terms of wanting to be in front of a camera and behind a keyboard. When did you realize, or was there never a time where you didn't feel this pull to be part of nature and wanting to advocate and do those things?
It was always something in the back of my mind. I think when I was a little kid, I wanted to be a fireman, but it was, growing up with those films and stories and listening to my grandfather talk about his adventures. I mean, it was real life Indiana Jones. So from pretty much as long as I can remember, I've always, been fascinated with travel and nature and wildlife. And my father died 6 months before I was born. And I have to really credit my mother, who raised my sister, Alexandra, and myself with this sense of responsibility. And she always was the first one to say, listen, you don't have to do that work. You don't have to be a filmmaker. You don't have to do any of that if you don't want to, but find a way in whatever you're passionate about to recognize that we all have a role and a responsibility to make the world a little bit better, to not just be consumers, but be producers and to give back. And it just so happened that, as a teenager at 16, I got to go to Papua New Guinea and I got to do these amazing things. And I was like, this is literally real life Indiana Jones. And, we're visiting with cannibal tribes up in the highlands of New Guinea. And we're, out filming for weeks in isolated and deserted bays with people in dugout canoes living in little huts on the beaches, coming and trading for, rice for fruit. And I was like, this is out of a movie. It was amazing. I almost died twice. Once, well, we won't go into those stories, but craziness. And I'm like, this is amazing. Right. So, and since all the adventures I've been on, from sleeping in unheated tents for, 10 days at a time in the Arctic and to being in the jungles, deep ocean, all the different things we've gotten to do are great adventures, but they all come with a responsibility. And my grandfather always talked about that. you have the opportunity to see these things and live an extraordinary life, then you have a responsibility to share it and not be selfish about that. And so that's really our role is as storytellers and continuing in the spirit of that legacy that I'm very proud of.
That's awesome. So before I read the book and did a deeper dive, no pun intended, into your life, I was thinking, what about, a memoir? Is that something you care about? But I realized it seems to me in all the best possible ways that your life's work is autobiographical.
That's true. I think, I think that for us, it's all mission driven. It's all our life's work is everything that's reflected in the work that we do. From the TV shows, even a show about hunting for Caribbean pirate treasure that we did for 3 seasons. My wife and I hosted for 3 seasons. It was a way to reach a different audience that might not watch an earnest documentary. And yet in the course of the show, we also found ways to sneak in stuff about climate change and invasive species and plastic pollution when we'd be wading through it in the shores of mangrove forests in Belize. And so everything is related, even though it may seem like, oh, you're doing TV and books and, starting businesses and doing stuff in, retail and et cetera, but it all has a purpose and it's all connected. And there's a consistent mission, if not, specifically consistent message, because, the mediums are all different. So the message changes sometimes.
Well, I think for an hour conversation, I think we covered pretty much all we could reasonably have covered. I certainly could talk a lot more, but we'll, as I like to abuse my modest power, I say, well, we just have to talk more another time.
Absolutely. Anytime, Sean. I really enjoyed it. And it was, we're actually working on another book, different, not a fiction book, a fact book right now. My wife and I are writing, but a book about the oceans. But still trying to bring some of the things that we know about writing fiction to that, to make it fun and accessible and not too earnest. But so we're always up to mischief, and we have book 2, but anytime, delighted, love the work that you're doing. I think it's so important to focus on books and literature and learning and listen beyond the 60-second sound bites that dominate the news these days, and the short little blogs of dubious provenance and all the data, and instead really be willing to learn and read, and that is so important. So thank you, Sean, for sharing some time with me. I really enjoyed it.
Well, absolutely a pleasure and an honor. And I will say in closing that, Philippe, one of the topics, as you can imagine, that comes up repeatedly in these conversations is this notion of inspiration and writer's block and how to do it. And frankly, your productivity, your superhuman passion and productivity is extremely inspiring. And I'm certain that people that didn't even realize that they were going to be inspired are getting a real hint in terms of this balanced life and how to follow what is important and do everything you can to use these storytelling skills that we're born with and cultivate those. So folks, please check this out, The Endangereds. I can recommend it heartily. And if you're of our generation, yes, your kids will love it and learn from it, but you'll love it and learn from it too. So Philippe, to be continued. But thank you for being here tonight. All the best. And like I said, my only request, more Murdoch.
Yeah, you got it. Next book, we've got a lot more Murdoch because we're in a little bit more aquatic environment. So it's hard when you're in a dry desert to have a narwhal participate. But promise, book 2, we go to Hawaii. So a little bit more fun there.
All right. Well, take care. Be well, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Sean, Talia, everybody, thank you so much. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed it, and I look forward to it.
All right. Cheers.